Hello, Dark Reader, and welcome to the Dark Side of the Library podcast. I'm your host, Katie, and on this minisode today, it's our first minisode of the new year of 2023. Woohoo! It is Saha. This is by Cho Nam-Joo. It is a Korean novel. I'm going to talk about Cho Nam-Joo first before we talk about the summary of the novel and my thoughts about it. So, who is Cho Nam-Joo? Well, she used to be a television scriptwriter. She did this for 9 years, and she had a debut novel. It's called Kim Ji-young, born 1982, sold in 19 countries and over 1 million copies. This book has done super duper well. Just really briefly about this book, it's basically about a 30-year-old something millennial lady. And she left her white-collar desk job in order to care for her newborn daughter full-time. And kind of from a Korean perspective, this is basically what many Korean women are expected to do. It's a really interesting novel, and I believe it has actually won awards. So many people were really excited about Saha as well. Let me tell you what the summary of Saha, the novel, actually is. This is how the publisher has written this out. Their marketing. So it says that this book, Saha, is very similar for fans who liked Netflix's Squid Games. And it also talks about how it's this chilling dystopian fable similar to like 1984. All right, so here's what it says. In a country called Town, a doctor named Sue is found dead in an abandoned car. There is only one place the police intend to look for her suspected killer, and that is the Saha Estates. This place is controlled by a secretive organization of ministers. Town is the safest, richest nation in the world, but it is a society clearly divided into the haves and have-nots, and those who have the very least, who aren't even considered citizens, live on the Saha Estates. Residents of Saha must squat in moldy units without plumbing, electricity, and can only find work doing harsh labor. For many people, the apartment complex is a bleak haven for escaping even bleaker pasts, as it was for Jin Kyun and her brother Do Kyun, who showed up one day sopping wet and shivering. No one is shocked when a lowlife like Do, the brother, becomes main suspect in Sue's, a citizen's, murder. But then Do Kyun disappears. Isolated in a barren Saha unit, Jin, the sister, makes a choice. She will finally confront a system hell-bent on erasing her brother's existence. To find him, she must rely on her tight-lipped neighbors, from the mysterious janitor known as the, quote, old man, to Granny Khanum, the community gardener and reluctant midwife, to Woomi, an unwitting test subject at a local clinic. On her quest for the truth, Jin will uncover a reality far darker than she could have ever imagined. So how does I, Katie, if you've never listened to this podcast before, rate this novel? I am going to unfortunately give this a 2. So when I read this whole thing, this was definitely up my alley. I love dystopian novels in general. I really, really like them. And I know how difficult it is to write a very successful one like Brave New World or 1984. I mean, it's hard. Right? It's not an easy thing to do. And maybe we can even draw inspiration from times right now, but, you know, it's still a pretty difficult task. It is nothing like Squid Game. So I almost feel like this is a bit of an injustice, and just because this is a Korean novel doesn't mean we need to mix in the whole Korean genre of dystopia together. There are some themes going on here, of course, between both of them, such as the disparity between our wealthy community members of Town versus the people who live in Saha. Sure, there might be something here, but we don't have blood and gore, poor people like in Squid Game trying to win big bucks, and they're in this deadly game where they might actually have to kill people. And just because they're both from Korea and dystopian and deal with societal issues does not make them the same. And I think that's a really terrible misunderstanding. In addition, we have this summary here where we are focusing on our protagonist, Jin, who is the sister of Do, and Do has gone missing. So that whole story gets muddled up and is by far not really the entirety of the novel. So how this whole story is broken up is, yes, we do begin with Jin, who is one of the residents of Saha, trying to find her brother. But then the novel turns into something else. And at first I thought this is a lot of info dumping. So now we get transitioned to basically the foundations of Saha and the development of this place called Town. This place used to be a fish farm and it was overtaken by some sort of corporation, and it's kind of like this weird city-state that isn't really quite capitalist, not really country, but we have people who live at the very, very top called the Elves, and they live this lavish life. In fact, I was starting to get a bit of this feeling, especially when I was reading kind of the summary and a little bit as, you know, we got this massive info dump. At first thinking this is kind of like, it's not quite Judge Dredd, but you've got like your top people, you're all living in Saha Estate. So I was thinking like this, you know, big giant estate that is run by like the worst communities, the bottom of the barrel kind of people. So I was getting Dredd feels, but also High Rise. I don't know if you've ever watched that, but it's got Tom Hiddleston in it. It's a weird movie, but I was getting some feels there where at the very top of this building, we have the richest of the rich, or even like the owner of this entire building, of this high rise. And then at the very, very bottom, we have things where people are experiencing power outages, no plumbing, and people start to overthrow the top in high rise. But anyway, I was kind of getting that sort of vibe from this book originally. So we have the Elves who live at the very, very top, not of Saha, but they live at the top of this place called Town. And then we have people who are below them. So the L2s, these are people that are, you know, on like temporary visas. They sit at the bottom, and that's usually at Saha Estates. A lot of people don't even remember the people that live in Saha Estates. You don't really volunteer to go live there unless shit's really, really bad. But there's such a massive wage gap that people who are in the L2 category try, or who are maybe on the edge of being L2, they try to obtain L status. And sometimes that's terrible. So we have a whole host of stories presented in the middle of the book. It's almost like an anthology of people that have lived in Saha, the foundations of Saha, and how Saha being in town, and what the corporations and what kind of things that they voted on, who's in charge, and how that affected the citizens of Saha and town, technically. Sometimes those stories were really interesting. There's one at the very beginning where it talks about this woman who has the opportunity. It's basically like a temp agency, and she's like, you got to give me some actual jobs here. And she's like, hey, I don't have an actual job for you, but, you know, you can get married to this really, really rich old asshole, and, you know, the worst that could happen is you might just have to run away. And nobody's going to give a shit about it because you'll probably run away to Saha Estates, but he's loaded. So this is the best opportunity that you're ever going to get. So she decides to do that, and he's a terrible human being. He's really awful, and she tries her best, and she ends up running away. So that was one of the better stories to kind of, show the differences between the two people, the L's and the L2s, and just the citizens of town, and just kind of the foundations of this whole entire place. Like, this place is supposed to be the pinnacle of everything. They have the best healthcare, they have the best, you know, all of these things, and yet they have this huge population of people that suffer greatly. So those are cool themes in the story, but the problem is every story tends to either trail off. There's no sense of anything actually coming to a close or even having a point, which that's the worst part, just leans too far into the fact that, hey, we've seen these stories before. You know how this goes. I don't need to do this for you. So that's how I felt in some stories. Other stories, they trailed off. There's a lot of loose ends and a lot of characters that they just go missing, or you just don't know what the purpose of it was, and it's very frustrating. So that was one big pitfall of this entire story. But the biggest pitfall of them all is we're following our protagonist, Jin, and she's trying to find her brother. There's this whole loop in the end that made me actually facepalm because it was just a hot mess. We are all trying to wait and figure out who actually killed Sue, the person in the car, and why did they do that thing. And there's so many questions that you're waiting for as you are reading about this anthology of Saha. So we're just kind of left waiting for a very long time. And then we don't really get a conclusion here. And it is just it's just not even important for the most part. It's like, okay, well, that was good. I'm glad I waited all that time for this. Not only that, there is this silly thing that happens where our protagonist, and this might be a spoiler, so plug your ears, our protagonist ends up being like a superhero. It's really weird. And the other issue here, especially at this weird like medical research center place that Jin ends up at, it's like she goes there and meets these people who are supposed to, I mean, like, this is a huge conspiracy, right? And they just tell her basically everything. It was like, what? Who does this? And there's no way that a massive conspiracy like that would be held for so long and nobody would utter a word about it if they just did that with some random person who's from Saha Estates. It was just, wow. Yeah, and then the end, very, very end, where there's this like random action scene and Jin is, somehow, it's corny. It's actually incredibly corny. Very disappointing. There was no huge revelation at the end of the novel. We don't have a full, complete story, and we have a lot of bits, chopped up pieces that never seem complete throughout this entire story. We don't even get, we can get very clearly that Saha Estates is not a place you want to live. It's the bottom of the barrel. It is, it's garbage. But then when you start to look away from it all, the lens, it's blurry. The story is blurry. Nothing is consistent. It's a little much. And then what's worse is that we don't have a completion. It was something that I was really looking forward to when reading this story because kind of like what I said earlier in this podcast episode is it is really difficult to build a very successful dystopian novel. But I like the idea of pulling some of that information, which she does. So our author, Cho Nam-Joo, she pulls a lot of stuff that we are feeling today. I mean, if you think about it, we live in the richest country in the entire world, allegedly. And we have these people at the very top of everything that do get the best of everything. But then there's a huge amount of the population where for living in such a rich place, like town is supposed to be this really rich place to the world from the outside. But looking in, you have this place where people are legit struggling, starving, no electricity. And that's here. We have that here in America. Or how easy it is if you are on the top. It's no guarantee. You can always slip up and mess up. Something can happen. I mean, Breaking Bad is a perfect example of that, even though we all know that he was a school teacher. So it's not like he was rich or anything. But, something slipped. He got cancer, and all of a sudden he has to deal drugs in order to survive in America. So there are things in this book that are great, and they just weren't expanded on, and they weren't tied together. There was just too much going on. There's a misleading publishing issue, in my opinion, where we're focusing on this murder mystery kind of thriller thing in a world of a dystopian novel, which seems to be mostly kind of in the background. And it would have been cool if one or the other was picked. So focusing on Saha, what it's like living in Saha and having it be an anthology would have been great if things were maybe tied and concluded in a very smooth way, or we just kept with that mystery thriller conspiracy bit. So I just think there was too much going on in this novel. If you are looking for a newer dystopian novel and you did read Cho Nam-Joo's previous novel, Born 1982, you might want to check out this book and see how it compares. I give it a 2-star, and I'd love to hear from you. Let me know what your thoughts are on the book, because that's the most important thing. It wasn't for me, but it could be for somebody else, and that's totally fine. We are all allowed to have differing opinions. That's what makes everything more interesting. But you can do that if you did want to chat about it. Make sure to give us a comment on YouTube. Subscribe. You can comment and rate and review on your favorite listening app. That really helps us. And you can come join us on our socials at Dark Side of the Library on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, etc. If you are looking for more dark reads, make sure to check out our show notes at darksideofthelibrary.com. We post all of our stuff there, including all of the curated books that we've found each and every month. So if there's something that you are looking for, we might have it. I hope everybody has had a great new year so far. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast episode. We will see you next week and have a creep-tastic rest of your week.